Hello and welcome to the Twin Raven Critique, where we take an hour out of our busy lives to discuss books, games, and whatever else comes to mind. I am your co host, Carrow Brown,
And I'm Jamie Keene.
and we are going to be discussing Dune by Frank Herbert today. You may have heard of it since it's been in a couple of movie adaptations, a radio drama, and a couple of other things. But don't worry, we won't completely ruin it for you. We're just going to explore the aspects of it that we really enjoy as intellectuals. So I was very happy to reread this, but I'm gonna fib to you a little bit. So the first time I read it, I read it on the Kindle, and the second time I decided to revisit it, I did the radio drama version that's actually on Audible.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize they had the radio drama on there.
They did, and it was so funny listening to, like, the 6 same voice actors they had, like, do all these different voices and everything. I was, like, so engaged.
That's cool. Yeah. Would you recommend that as like a an alternative source if someone's maybe already read the book?
Yeah, because it's interesting the way that they broke up the narrative and the way that, individuals talk, and in some places, I felt like it added, another element to the story. In other ones, I was like, "That's not how I pictured Lady Jessica to speak."
Oh, sure.
Um, yeah, but I mean, it's like anything where you take it from a page to screen, as I like to call it.
Hmm.
But it was fun, and I really enjoyed the take that the studio took with it. So if anybody is a fan of audiobooks, that one would be it. I'll put it in a link in the video description below.
Did they do any like Foley?
A
They
little
have
bit.
that's
Yeah.
that's my favorite part of
Yeah,
like
yeah, a
stuff
little
from
bit.
that. Those are the best.
Mhm. So you
Cool.
were very eager to talk about this book, if I remember right.
Oh
What
yeah.
was Yeah, why okay, so what was your big motivation for, like, we have to talk about this book?
I think this book for me, what like one of the reasons I like it so much, and obviously I'm very excited about it because the movies are coming out, and to everyone's great surprise, the movies are not dog shit. They're actually amazing, which is rare for an adaptation, I feel like these days. But the movies have been great. The books are so good. And for me, it's been like an important part of my life since like I was in middle school, I think, is when I first picked one up. My aunt sort of irresponsibly put it in my hands at a very young age because I guess she like wanted me to be like an advanced reader, you know? She was
Mhm.
like always trying to put very complex books in front of me. So she gave me this thinking that the crazy like 1,000 page count would scare me off, and by the end of it I was like ready to be lapsed Catholic.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, cool. I've learned so much from this book. Yeah, and so I think like what excites me about it is that I mean, obviously there's been plenty of works of sci-fi that get pretty good about their messaging and like having good stories to tell and stuff like that, and we can talk about some of those maybe another time. But this one, it basically like inspired them all for the most part. I mean, this was a pretty early work
Mhm.
of like what we think of as science fiction, and it's one of the first books, it's like one of the first like nerd books that I encountered in a history of like reading classic nerd books that didn't basically insist that religion was like a for sure thing,
Mhm.
you know.
Yep.
A thing that really was sort of like took me out of or made it harder for me to enjoy the world building of a place like Middle Earth or something like that is
Mhm.
that it's just the cosmology is all like set in stone, and we just sort of know it, you know. We don't have to be skeptical about it because it's just like a given, and so there aren't any real like skeptics in those worlds that make sense, you know. They just seem like crazy people. It wasn't until I mean, I think it's like it shows up in George R. R. Martin's work too, like in Game of Thrones. You get a cool setting where there's a bunch of different like religions and gods, and it's like, well, do they exist? And like, how good are they? And like, is this a human institution or is there like a power behind it, you know?
Mhm.
So this book, right from the jump, one of the things I like the most about it is just the religions are so obviously human institutions, and
Mhm.
they he leaves enough space that like maybe you could make the argument that, oh well, maybe there's a little bit of divine providence going on here, but
Oh, yeah.
by and large it's like these religions are definitely human constructs. They've been like put together by these cabals of very forward thinking, very elite humans, and basically like used to extort and exploit people,
Mhm.
which is fucking great. you know? It's so good. I love that it finally, there's something that takes that bent.
So on that note, I should probably read the synopsis of it real
Yeah, oh,
quick.
true.
So
Yeah.
so Paul is a brilliant and gifted young man born into a great dynasty before his understanding and must travel to the most dangerous planet in the universe to ensure that his future and his family of his people. The malevolent forces exposed into conflict over the planet's supply of the most precious resource in existence, and only those who can conquer their own fear will survive. So that's I'm taking a little bit from the film synopsis because if I take from the book synopsis, it kind of gives the plot away. So again, spoilers ahead. Please tread with caution, as I usually like to do. You mentioned before that this was one of the earlier works of science fiction, and I definitely can attest that this is one of those keystone books that sets the example of this particular genre. And what I mean by keystone, if you guys have not quite familiar with that, is that's the book that basically all other books are kind of founded off of, right? And it's one thing to, kind of take inspiration from and copy from, but this is a book that I always, whenever I read science fiction at some point in about, I'll say 7 out of 10 books, I'll be like, yeah, at some point you read Dune, right?
Yeah, right. You figure out where it is in their fingerprint. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the most intriguing things about this book, and we can talk about that at any point that you're ready to, but it was so interesting the dynamic between free choice, destiny, and not being able to fight against it. Because I felt like that was such a reoccurring theme within the entire book. So like the book has so many different things that are going on in it. So for example, you touched on religion, right?
Yeah.
So there's religion, there's politics, there's fate and free will. There's the coming of age that Paul goes through. There's fear, there's family, there's the traditions and customs versus, the evolution of society, and then how power affects the mind, right? Like so much stuff is going on in this book, but like you said earlier, it's a 1,000-page book.
Yeah, definitely true. And I think the thing with his destiny, what feels like destiny to him, is informed by like the kind of feeling that we have, like any ordinary person would have deja vu. But
Mhm.
everything for him, I feel like, is like that much more enhanced, just a little bit, because it's like you've got all these different things. You've got him sort of under the effect of spice melange, right? And then you
Mhm.
also have him with like Bene Gesserit training, you know?
Mhm.
So
Oh, the
if it
Benny
were,
Gesserit were so fun for me.
yeah,
But
right.
let me let you continue though. I apologize for cutting you
No,
off.
that's I mean, we should for sure talk about them. It's like all these different factors. You can see this like sort of transhumanism philosophy's version of like a messiah coming to be, or like a perfect person that's like absolutely engineered to take the most advantage of certain things, which they basically lay out. Like that was the plan, right? They were
Mhm.
gonna sort of create like a superhuman, but it wasn't supposed to be Duke Atreides' son.
Mhm.
And then you add to that the fact that he's on drugs that make you a supercomputer and like let you see the future. And suddenly he has like a very clear picture of what's ahead of him, maybe
Mhm.
more than anyone else who has ever come before.
You can see the Matrix, right?
Right, yeah, pretty much. I mean, in a way, and they sort of make it out as like, oh, it's prophecy, you know? But it's
Mhm.
just this like impression of what's going to happen because he's like figured it out that far in advance. So like when he like recognizes someone he's never seen before and he's like, "Oh, you know, I thought this was going to end one way and it went a fucking other way. I guess prophecy is fallible." I think that's like that's not prophecy, you know? That's like he had that while he was on his ayahuasca vision trip in the desert.
Mhm.
That's not when God speaks to you. That's just a drug trip.
Yeah, it is a drug trip. No, and I remember there was a later part in that particular book where he talked about, where he could see like the distant future and like thinking about the jihad that was to come. And that's literally what it's called in the book before anybody comes at me.
Yeah.
And his summary of that moment was like even though he saw that the inevitable was coming, he could not see any steps to avoid it because that was just kind of like the way that human nature was just going to go. Like the entirety of humans or the human will or whatever we want to call it, which is like we just want to fight right now. Like we had resorted to our like most basic instinct to fight and commit war and violence onto each other because of whatever reason that we could conjure at the time. And you can almost relate that to the way that we try to address like current things that are going on in our society, right? Like we can't just say like we have to talk about it or we have to resolve it. We have to commit war on it. right? So, like, war on AIDS, war on terrorism, war on whatever, right? I'm using the big ones from the 1990s. But anytime that we want to address or change something, we have to commit war on it, right? We can't just kind of like logistically talk about like, well, in order to fix it, let's just do it this way.
Yeah, it seems like at the end of the day, if there's a lot of precedent in human history that leans in that direction versus a more diplomatic solution is that if you want immediate change of like a very old system that's very like codified and like baked into people's minds, you
hmm
pretty much have to be like revolutionary in a kind of violent way.
I think that's kind of like the basic nature of revolution itself, though, because whenever you have to change something, right, and you're going against the grain, if you're getting pushback, then you have to push back harder, right? And so anytime there's some kind of social change or social evolution, like it's not an easy transition. Like we can look through like the last 200 years of history and see like where we made the most progression at. We made the most progression where we had to basically like go up against how it had been for, like, 20 plus years or something like that. So I guess you could say that Dune is I don't know, how would you word that?
I think revolutionary minded.
Okay, I like
It
that.
leans that direction because basically this is like a coming of age story for a person who almost necessarily has to be a revolutionary leader.
Okay, so I'm really glad that you mentioned that because when I was looking at the coming of age theme, I was thinking about you, and I was like, "So how would you like to tackle that particular topic in this book?"
I mean, that's how I think. That's what it is, right? Like he's not. He even sort of grasps it very quickly. He does it in the book, and he also they did the scene great in the movie when he sort of confronts his mother and says like, "What did you do to me? Like, this is my existence. You made me into this. Like, I have to." Lead a revolution against the most powerful man in the universe and also his like evil army. You
Mhm.
know, not a very cool thing to put on someone who is a teenager, but they buck up, and so he does. And that's sort of the point of the whole book. And then the sequels, for those of you who got lazy and stopped at book one, that's what they're about. So keep reading.
Well, the nice thing I will say about the movie that came out, because there's always the page to screen critics and that come out. I will say that if you watch the movie, in the movie, they tried to address things that were coming out a little later that showed up in the book but didn't show up in book one. And as somebody who has written a book, I can tell you, at least from my perspective, and you guys can put in your own feedback in the comment section if you like. When you're writing your first book, you're still kind of figuring it out. And then as you progress further with the story, like it fleshes out more and it makes a lot more sense. But that first book, like when it's out there in the world, like that's kind of it. So for example, Paul's relationship with like Duncan, right?
Yeah.
If you go through book 1, like, his relationship with Duncan, I'm gonna say is really kinda, like, superficial. It's kind of like Duncan was there, Duncan would say things to him, Paul would be like, "Okay, XYZ," but there wouldn't be, like, a bigger emotional reaction to it. So when you
Right.
get into the later books and you see that Paul is, like, literally lamenting the loss of Duncan, you're kinda like, "What is going on?"
Yeah.
Because
Like,
this wasn't
why?
here in the first book. Yeah. So when they were doing the first movie, they actually tried to show that relationship that Duncan and Paul had, and I thought they did that really well because I was like, "Oh, good, good," like that nod of approval that you do in the theater.
Yeah, the healthy change. There were a couple of
Mhm,
healthy changes. One thing that I think they didn't do enough time on is the whole what's the deal with Dr. Yue and like that subplot of like the traitor, the betrayal.
mhm.
Very confusing the way that they present that in the movie because they really don't. They basically just like skip through all the important parts
Mhm.
of that. But I think the reason they did that is because that part of the book drags just a little, you know. Um,
Yeah, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of interpersonal communications, and they're putting in, like, little breadcrumbs that lead to, like, later situations. But,
yeah,
yeah, no,
it helps
I
to explain the context of why, but
mhm,
it doesn't do a very good job of like making it super interesting.
mhm. Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Could have happened off screen, which it
It could
did.
have. It could have been in a memo.
Yeah, right. So that bit definitely was a thing I was pleased to see sort of done a little differently in the movie.
I want to talk about the free will and fate themes that are in this book, if you are of a mind to do so with me.
Yes, let's.
Okay. So there was a couple of things in here that I thought were really interesting. That was, free will versus fate, right? And there's a moment when Lady Jessica is being berated, right? By one of the orderly ones, we'll call them that for right now. And they're berating her because she got to choose if she was gonna have a Paul or Paulina, so to speak, right? And it was so interesting because in her free will to make this choice, right, she ended up, like, fulfilling destiny, right? Even though, like, the social constraints at the time were kinda like, "No, you need to do this because all of us are female, and you need to make a female." And she was like, "No, I'm gonna have a son because it makes my husband happy."
Right. Yeah, sort of an interesting act of defiance from an otherwise loyal pawn in a very like deliberate scheme that sort of threw
Mhm.
everything off course. But it
But then it
also,
kept it on course,
yeah,
right?
it also kept a different thing on course.
And I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of like the limitations of like human understanding of like the greater forces at work, right? I feel like this conversation has come up a little bit more often than I would like in like daily conversation, but it's when we're trying to grasp things that are outside of our understanding rather than just accepting, like, no, I don't really quite know. This is like the blueprint that I want, but, I'll kind of wing it from here. You've got people that are coming out of the woodwork being like, no, it's exactly like this. And it's going to be A, B, and C. And if it's not D, then the whole world's going to burn.
Yeah, people making overconfident assertions of a divine will that they shouldn't by definition be able to understand or interpret, right? The concept of ineffability
Hmm.
seems to escape most people.
Right, and you see that both in this book and both outside of the book too. So I was, like when I was rereading this book, or rather re-listening to the radio drama of this book, and like I was making too many correlations between like kind of semi conversations that were had and then the ones that were in the book. I was like, oh, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, too real. As
Mm-hmm.
well it should be, I think.
Yes.
Helps us prepare mentally, I think, for the larger world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sort of to your point. So, specifically about free will, I think one of the interesting things that I like from uh, my barely a little bit of biology background is this concept of like a human being exceptional from animals, basically only in that we have the ability to augment our decision making criteria outside of our immediate like context or circumstances. Do you know what I mean? So like what separates a person from an animal is being able to plan ahead, basically. Or like know that yes, I'm hungry in this situation, but if I steal this person's food, I might eat now, but it will be worse for me or harder for me in the future, right?
I guess when we're talking about what makes us different from animals and all of that, like the basic thing that people like to say is I've got opposable thumbs, right? But you've got opposable thumbs and the means to use them and the means to think about how to use them, right?
Yeah, it's more like it's more a consequence of like the size of the human brain and the fact that we, sort of evolved the way we did, but the there's like a mechanism of human planning or like strategizing that defies,
Mhm.
it doesn't exist really elsewhere except in like really specific examples of like whales or elephants, but it's basically the ability to forego instinct in favor of good decision making,
Mm.
and that
There's
happens, that's a theme in the
going
book. It happens all like a bunch of different times. um
yeah, going against the instinct.
Right. And my favorite example, my favorite scene, I think, really in the whole book, it, like solidifies Paul as like a worthy main character in my mind a little bit, is
Mhm.
that the trial of the Gom Jabbar needle, basically, when
Oh,
he meets
yes.
with Gaius.
Mhm.
Because that to me, finally, I was like, okay, this character's cool, and like I get the point of of the book also, and like why they're trying to make this such a big deal. The notion that like you should suffer temporarily if it means that you live to fight another day. You take the bad with the good in order to get the best possible outcome.
So that's interesting because when I know what you're talking about with that scene, but one of the big takeaways I also took with that scene, when he had the needle and all this other stuff, was that I would not make choices through fear, right?
Right.
And a lot of individuals, when they're going through choices or life or anything else like that, there's always the fear that's involved. There's the eustress and the de-stress, right? And when I was re-listening to this, I was thinking about it in the terms of like, I won't make choices out of fear just because, I don't know what will happen on the other end of it. In that particular scene that you're talking about, like, he was possibly facing death, right?
Yeah.
But he was like, I'm not gonna face death being afraid. I'm gonna let this fear wash over me, and I'm gonna be myself, and I'm gonna progress onwards." And that was, technically, I mean, we won't know what the other option would have ended up being, but that was the one that led him onto the path of who he ended up being, right? And you can also see throughout the book whenever he was faced with certain situations that would honestly send most people, like, in the fetal position on the floor, where he would be like, I've got a choice to make. I can either let this fear decide my decisions, or I can make these decisions for myself. And he was always making not quite the decisions for himself. I'll say he was making it for a greater good, because at one point he just became, the deciding factor of entire civilization.
Definitely true though that he is kind of doing that or filling that role, this idea of like someone who will necessarily sacrificially do the difficult thing through pain and fear, which is kind of, I
Hmm.
mean, that's why those are the two Bene Gesserit litanies, right? Is like
Hmm.
uh, I ignore the pain, I ignore my fear. It's both of those things are just feedback that I'm receiving. It doesn't color reality, and I need to be able to see past it and through to the other side, because
Hmm.
when this temporary thing is done, there's still going to be all of the consequences of my choices and the world and things that need to happen a certain way, so I can't lose sight of that in the face of
Hmm.
this thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I really enjoy that theme. I like it a lot. It shows up again in like a really obscure spot, but it's when they're first explaining the sandwalk.
Mhm.
The notion that like, oh, it's kind of difficult to do this. You have to like basically commit to for hours at a time, deliberately breaking up the pace of your walking, which is way harder task than just simply walking through the desert, which would be hard enough anyway,
Mhm.
because you have to spend that much more time focusing on like breaking your rhythm. Just this like constant thing where it's like, okay, your superpower, willpower. Willpower and
Yeah.
thinking ahead.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that, and I guess, like, unlike the last book that we read, I was doing, like, way too many details with this one. But when I was getting through that part of the book, one of the things I was thinking about was it's, a lot of people like to call it mindfulness, right?
Hmm.
And it's the thing that we do with willful intention, with whatever it is that we decide to do. If we go out for a walk, are we just walking, or are we taking in the sensory of what our feet feel like on the ground and how the air is on our face and the bird song and all that stuff, or are we just mindlessly walking in a direction, right? But when you have to break up like the typical routine, which allows for automated thinking, which is what we call it, then that takes a different kind of awareness and a self control. Willpower, like you correctly described it, because some people, when they're faced with having to go through what they're used to doing and change, they usually will take the path of least resistance. And if that's not changing, then they're not going to do it.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty cool to think about. I wonder if this is like a thing that spies need to concern themselves with a lot. Is like, oh, it's so obvious that you're like putting a lot of effort and thought into doing this. Like, if you were a normal person, you wouldn't do this.
If I ever meet one, I will let you know.
Yeah.
But I do want to circle back to a comment that you made before to kind of throw it out there before we move on.
Yeah.
And you talked about how, we as humans have the ability to be intellectually superior to our instincts. And the reason I wanted to circle back to that is because I'm actually currently reading a book, and it's called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. And he talks about how, because as humans, we think that we're so superior to our instinct that we can go ahead and meddle in natural processes. And the example that he was kind of focusing on was mostly childbirth, right?
Mm.
And he had a couple of anecdotes from women who wanted to, have a natural vaginal birth, and doctors kept trying to push them for C-sections. Now, I'm not stupid, and I definitely was born at night, but not last night. And I know a lot of reasons that doctors like to push for C-sections is because they're a lot quicker than 48-hour labors,
Hmm.
right? And so there were a lot of doctors who would try and push their will onto these women, saying, "Well, I'm a doctor and I intellectually know more, and I think you have to let me do a C-section." Where these mothers to be had the instinct of like, "No, that is not what I want to do. Like, I want to have a vaginal birth and I want to do these things." And it's only honestly been within like the last 20 years where we really pushed for when a woman has birth, instead of taking her baby away and like doing suction tubes and all this other stuff to actually give the baby to the mother to like reinforce that mother daughter bond or mother son bond or whatever you want to call them, right? There was something in that passage that really struck me because a lot of times, because we are intellectuals as a species, right? We think better, we build stuff, we destroy stuff, we create stuff, we do all sorts of things. And I think sometimes in that arrogance, we think that we know better than what our baser instincts are trying to tell us. And in doing that, we kind of like slowly unravel the things that make us who we are.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, obviously, you can point out any number of institutions or ideas or even just like behaviors that basically are destructive, obviously, and like not a good thing and
Mhm.
sort of defy instinct, perhaps. Yeah, I think, a good lesson from this particular book is maybe like be in tune with your situation, like, be aware
Mhm.
of basically the things around you. Think about the world that you live in. Think about the challenges it's going to throw at you, and like be literate. Like, choose to know to look for yourself and like figure out for yourself and see for yourself the consequences that you may face through the life that you can basically guess that you're probably going to have.
Mhm.
I like the idea that you should sort of have agency and take agency and personal responsibility for the outcomes of actions and where you are in your life.
Oh, Paul did that all the time in this book.
Yeah, right. Like, you have to. The only way you can really know that you're in trouble or that you're being led astray or anything like that is if you're actually putting the onus of like understanding the way the world is on yourself and not just,
Mhm.
I don't know, you got to be proactive.
And good topics. So what was another part of this book that you wanted to discuss?
Well, let me think. Oh, I remember. How could I forget? Need I even say? Another great part about this book is drugs. Delicious drugs. And maybe more than that, the idea that like practices, if it's a mantra, if it's some extreme conditioning, or if it's some drug use, um, if you like apply them deliberately for a practical purpose, you can alter your being and become something greater. If you need to travel across space, you can take a drug, see the future. If you need to do a lot of math real fast, you can train as a mentat and also do
Mhm.
drugs. If you need to
Threads.
command someone with your voice, think back to your Bene Gesserit upbringing and just make it happen. The part of the people in this book who are sort of remarkable are all remarkable because of something that they've been through, right? Like the
Mhm.
Atreides are relatively, they're like tough, but they're kind of only okay in battle and sort of get steamrolled by the Sardaukar. Lived on this like very cool, comfortable planet, water, no problem, pretty good place to be.
Mhm.
Um, but if you are living an insane life and you've had to like be in this like really harsh environment or really violent context, like the Sardaukar or the Fremen, also, it's like that. All the badasses in this are either from someplace really hard or had a really hard upbringing. And the idea that like good doesn't just drop out of the sky and like fall into the lap of the most complacent people is kind of refreshing, because usually the people who actually end up making a change are sort of like forged in the fires of adversity, and kind of have to put in effort and extreme like train themselves or educate themselves or condition themselves to be exceptional. And it's something that maybe I haven't seen a ton of in other books, especially not drugs. I feel like most people aren't going to go there, but definitely true that you start seeing the world a different way when you're in a different state of mind, and that can be valuable.
I know when I was so way back when I was a much younger Carrow Brown, and I didn't even have a Carrow Brown name. Way before that, I was in a creative writing class. And first off, if you guys take a creative writing degree, you don't actually do a lot of time doing creative writing. You do a lot of time doing technical writing. So if you don't like grammar, that's not really the degree for you. But I did manage to snag a class where we got to write and critique each other's groups group submissions. And the one thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that there was a guy and he was a poet and he used to do a lot of public speaking. What he would say is, I'm not going to tell you guys to take substances because that's irresponsible, but like maybe you should be sleep deprived or you should have too much caffeine or something because that does something to your mind where you're able to see things the way that you normally don't see. And maybe that might be a testament to that earlier thing about mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
We get so used to doing something in the automative, um, sense of being that we don't really take the time to really look outside of that sphere because we've fallen into the rhythm. And if you take a substance, whether it be caffeine or something else, and I don't recommend it because that's not the kind of channel that I have, then it kind of kicks your awareness out of that spot for a minute and lets you experience something different. But I would say, in the context of this book, whenever they would talk about the substance of this book, I would almost like kind of like equate it to some kind of performance steroid in a sense, because it's either making you move faster or think faster or do any of those other things.
Yeah. Or see the future or have crazy
Seeing the
visions.
future, having some hallucinations, that's a different thing. But yeah, that's totally something that the book of Dune was totally talking about. And I'm saying that so that way I don't get upset with like the algorithm.
I wouldn't stress the algorithm. It's gonna do what it do.
Oh, no, it always does what it does, but it always looks for, like, little keywords and things like that.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I would have to say my substance of choice would actually be alcohol. And the reason that it's alcohol is because when I'm awake and aware, I'm like hyper vigilant of like everything, right?
Hmm.
And so I don't actually get a chance to like relax and like let my brain do like those fun chemical things. Probably it's not quite dopamine. I can't remember what the chemical reaction is called. But when you are relaxed and you're in a state of kind of deep relaxation, your brain gets really, really creative. Quincy Jones actually did a book about, 12 Notes for Life, which I thought was funny. But he did this book and he talked about anytime he worked with an artist, performer, or anything else like that, he would actually schedule them to come into the studio to do their recordings at 12 to 2 a.m. in the morning. And the reason he did that was because he had learned that if he got these people like super tired and they weren't overthinking their lives or anything else like that, they were actually able to produce their better work.
That's cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's I mean, good insight, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, people are just sort of more interesting when they're free of the bounds. Sorry, what did you call it again? What the normative state or
Oh, like, I don't know if you're asking me and I already forgot what it was. That's how, like, in tune I was.
it was a good
It's kind
word,
of
but
about, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's basically like when you're in the automotive state where you're just, like, doing and you're, like, fixing and you're trying to get things done, and you're not, like, creatively thinking of, like, other things or you're not relaxed, right?
right.
I mean, I hate to say this, but let's think about you and me doing this podcast right now. Like, are we actually relaxed right now?
I'm a little relaxed.
I am also a little relaxed, but let me tell you, I had 2 glasses of something to help me get there.
Yeah.
I think for us to be creative and to be able to think of things creatively, we have to not be pressured down by, like, other things that we're having to juggle at the time. Now, that might be, like, family, that might be work, that might be a whole bunch of other stuff. It's definitely, I think, a testament that when we want to do something that is outside of the box thinking, we can't actually be in the presence of the things that make the box, right?
Right. So that's fun. That's one of the things I like about it. Anyway, yeah, but I mean, look, even this, just talking about it now, it drags those good conversations out of you. It really forces you to contend with some like kind of deep stuff.
And it's a really great book for that because there's so many books where they're kind of like you can go pick up a book and it's kind of like, oh, it's the power of love and people coming together, and maybe it's just because I'm older and I look back on books that came out like closer to like how old I am, but the books that used to come out, at least when I was growing up, they felt like they had a lot more substance, right? So you've got Dune, which talks about like all these different things that we've been kind of talking about, so like religion, politics, free will, coming of age, fear, power, free thinking, all that stuff, right? Like that's just condensed into one little tiny book. And then you've got like what's the other book? Lord of the Flies,
Uh-huh.
right? And Lord of the Flies has one of my favorite lessons of society, which is society is only civil when one has the other to hold the other accountable, right? And that's a huge, deep thing to explore. And that book is usually given to people in middle school, right?
Is it?
Hello? Yeah, yeah. I read it in middle school. I don't
Oh,
know if it's yeah.
I don't know if they do that anymore.
I mean, I can check, but when I was in middle school, we it was one of the books that you could have on the bookshelf. It wasn't being discussed in class, but it was a
Oh,
book that you were allowed to have in your they called it in-class library.
I see. Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a. I don't think there was ever a time when I brought a book to school and they were like, "Whoa, hang on, kid." But I was usually reading like pretty above my level, I would say. I think they just didn't
Mhm.
care.
Let's see, what else? What's another book? Fahrenheit 451.
That one I read.
Animal Farm, that was required reading. I don't know if it is right now. But I guess the point I'm trying to make isn't, the books I had to read mandatory by school, but it was that the books that were written back then were addressing current problems at the time, but they also had other layers that were attached to it.
Yeah,
And I don't want to say that current books that are coming out for both our ages and younger ages are shallow, but sometimes they feel like that, right? Like they're kind of like lacking that in-depth thought that really kind of brings those subplots and those character themes and character arcs to life. And I can't tell you why because I don't really write in those particular genres at this point. But
I could make a
I
guess.
tell me.
My guess would be that probably what has changed so much is that now everyone is sort of like treating it like a homework assignment a little bit,
Mm.
where
Oh,
they're
so they're not thinking about it?
well, no, I think they are thinking about it. I think they're thinking about it in a way that someone who trains for a standardized test their whole life thinks about things, which is what are the boxes that I need to check, and
Mhm.
they're not sort of feeling it out. They're just sort of going through the technical motions of doing it. So what they arrive at feels like a thing, like a finished product. And technically, if you graded it on a rubric, it would be a meaningful story about a current event thing or a
Mhm.
current like thing we need to care about. But
Mhm.
then it's just sort of missing the chutzpah, the charisma of the story is not there
Mhm.
because that's something that you can't really put on a template.
Yeah, you have to really read and embrace something that's coming to really get at that level.
Mm-hmm.
We'll
Oh,
mention Harry Potter because I think Harry Potter is a really good example. People read those books, and one of the things that they do is they get so invested that they attach themselves to one of the Hogwarts houses, right?
yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that
anyone would.
yeah, and they love those worlds and they love everything that's involved with it. But if you mention like I don't know, like Animal Farm or those other books that I mentioned, they'll be kind of like, oh, I read it in school, right?
Right. Yeah, whether or not anyone gives a shit about what it's trying to
Yeah,
convey. That's true.
yeah, and one of the things that kind of scares me, in particular in foreign 451, if you guys want to go read it, is where they talk about kind of like the AIs that tell you what to do, right? But they and I guess the reason I laugh at that is because if you think about the way that news articles are generated to us or the way that we review material, it's not because somebody from the desk next door had, the daily newspaper on their desk. It's because at some point an electronic device sent it our way, right?
Mm,
Yeah. So, but I don't want to go down too deep that train of thought because that leads into Big Brother story. So I
yeah.
don't want to do that.
We'll get there. I'm sure we'll get there.
I mean, there is the Big Brother story that we can read at some point.
Yeah. But I was going to say another point besides what we just mentioned also. Another reason why that might happen. I think readers like the writer's readership, the writer's sort of backlog, I guess.
Hmm.
Their own library at home. I think
Hmm.
that a lot of the stories that I have read and been kind of like meh about that I've read recently are written by people that I get the sense probably don't do a lot of reading.
Hmm.
I think that's a big important thing, and also like reading of like good quality, not like
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. So for a little while, I was about to launch a publishing company. I had to put that on hold for right now because of various reasons. But I remember I had a conversation with one of my authors who wrote a story. And I asked them, like, "What books in this genre have you read?" And their response was like, "I haven't read any." I was like, "Let me get this straight. You wrote a book in a genre that you don't read." And he was like, "Yep."
yeah,
And I said, "Okay, no
bold.
bueno. Yeah, no bueno."
Yeah,
And
definitely.
Yeah, and the reason I say that isn't because I feel like you have to read other people's work and emulate it. No, absolutely not. But I mean, at this point in the game, there's and, say what you want to say, but there's no original ideas, right? There's your idea on how you decide to work with an idea and evolve it, right?
Yeah.
And when you write a story and you haven't read anything else in the genre, one of the disconnects that's going to happen is the common trends and expectations that happens with readers, right? So, one example, not related to the one example that I gave, is when you work with urban fantasy, for example. So, urban fantasy typically has a female protagonist, but sometimes there's a male. We're flexible with that. But the female protagonist at some point they're special, right? They have some special ability. Maybe it's magic, maybe they can talk to spirits, whatever. It's not your typical thing. But it's not educated enough that as they move into the rest of the story that they have enough concrete examples. So they have to explore it along with the reader. Good job. That's what we like to do. And one of the common expectations that happens with urban fantasy is that there is the otherworld sensation, which means that on top of the typical world that we have, there's another world that's right under it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and there's a couple of other tropes and story beats. That's what we call them that have to happen within particular genres. But if you haven't read it, right, and you haven't, drowned yourself in it, so to speak, then you're not really going to know that. So, for example, I'm going to talk about my job real quick. I got to copy edit the script for ISO number one over at Ripperverse, right? And before I got to actually get to that phase, I was talking to, the actual writer. I got to talk to Eric July about it. And I told him, I was like, I'm going to let you know right now, with my thumb on the pulse of how things are, people don't like super powered characters. They like characters with limitations, right?
Yep.
And you don't have to tell them what the limitation is. You just need to have the limitation there, and you have to make sure that's more interesting than the power itself, right?
Yep.
That was the only thing that I told him, before I went to, edit it later after he got done writing it. And he did such a good job with keeping that in mind, that it is always a topic of interest of his fan base, where they're trying to figure out what the power is. And it's not because of what he can do, but it's what he can't do, right?
Right.
And you wouldn't know that if you weren't, like, so, like, like, head deep in the genre.
Yeah. I think having a wealth of good examples to build from,
Mhm,
and like sort of even just sort of getting a sense of like what will work and what doesn't, and like what you like to read. You know,
mhm.
it's a bit like being a chef with no taste buds. I imagine being a writer who has not read much, because how are you supposed to know if what you're writing is any good if you don't have like a wealth of examples of writing you do and don't like too?
I think that's just arrogant. Like, I'll come out and say it's just arrogant.
Yeah, it's arrogance, but yeah, I think it's so accessible to people now, and delivery mechanisms are so accessible for the first time ever that everyone is like
Mhm.
taking a crack.
Oh,
And
yeah.
sometimes they're not putting in the effort that's required on the front end, I should say, like
Mhm,
the pre-work, if you will, of reading.
mhm.
All right, did you say what your favorite moment was?
No, I was actually about to ask you that.
Oh, okay. My favorite moment, yeah, again, Gum Jabbar test. Uh, that's the coolest scene as far as I'm concerned, because I think that was like when I sort of like pieced together, oh, okay, I got it. It's that kind of story. That's what this is about. And that was what sort of made me stop thinking about the book as an internal self-contained thing, and thinking about it more as like a message that applied to things, something I should think more deeply about.
Mhm.
That was the dog whistle, if you will.
Oh, the dog whistle thing that caught your attention?
Yeah, it was for me.
I mean, that's a great moment. My moment that is probably my favorite moment is when Lady Jessica was having the conversation, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, about the fact that she was told by her order to have a girl, but she had a boy. And the reason that stuck out to me the most, outside of what we kind of already talked about in regards to like free will and destiny and all this other stuff, is that when she made that choice, she had to make a very difficult choice in itself, right? Because she didn't just have this baby with anybody, but she actually loved the person that she had this baby with. And at some point, she decided that her family was more important than this group that she came from. And I guess what was really powerful about that for me is, and you're willing, I mean, I would welcome your discourse on this, is that in today's day and age, we don't really like to focus so much on the family unit, but kind of like the society unit. So it's like what you contribute to society versus what you contribute to your family unit. And although it may have been a bit selfish for her to consider the needs of her husband before the needs of the order that she came from, I kind of respected it in the sense that, these people that she came from, right? Like, they didn't have to have the baby or raise the child or anything else like that. They just told her what to do and just expected her to do it like she was some, like, freaking worker ant, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, but she was the one that was gonna have to, like, carry it, birth it, raise it, love it, guide it. And she definitely did all of those things, like, all the way until the end. So that was a moment that always stuck out with me because it was an act of defiance, but it was also an act of love in a many multitudes.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, I mean, of all the places where someone should feel justified in their act of defiance, I think it's when the cult that you belong to is telling you to create a supervillain, basically.
Mhm.
Then it's like,
Mhm.
oh, well, maybe I would rather just be a normal person and like make this choice for me and like it's I didn't have a say in whether I was the person that had to do this or not. And I'm not
Mhm.
also gonna put that like further. She's just kind of like, well, I'm at this point. I get to make this choice. I'm gonna make it the way I want to make it.
Mhm.
I think that's something that everyone should always do all the time. Is not give in to the program. Don't stick with
Mhm.
like do your own thing. Do what feels right.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Let me
And
see what else.
which she does. And I think it's nice too that her relationship with Papa Atreides is kind of odd. Not in that, I mean, of course it is, but also it's like they like each other clearly very much. They're very like devoted. They don't get married because it's politically advantageous to not, so there is like there's a little bit of overlap where it seems like she's willing to sort of bend over further or like bend over backwards more so than he
Mhm.
is, but he does like her, but he also is like, nah, well, I can't celebrate you. Later in the movie, I think only in the movie, maybe not in the book, but in the movie, he says like, well, I regret it. I should have married you, but I didn't.
Oh, that happened in the book too. I do
Yeah,
remember that. Yeah, they had a moment before like this big meeting where it's like if I had the choice I would have married you and celebrated it and all this other stuff. And I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of the will of heart and the will of society, right? Because they're at that point they're both like, under the influence of social norms,
yeah,
right? 'Cause he had a mistress, and that was Lady Jessica, and Lady Jessica bore him a son, and at some point, he was expected to marry another noble who would have, elevated his house higher, but he chose not to because he loved Lady Jessica so much, so he was just willing to be like, "Nah, I'm a good."
yeah.
Rebels. That's what they are, they're both rebels.
Yeah, they're rebels. The whole family of them, which is great. I'll be honest. There's a part of this book that eludes me even after much study, which is that I'm not sure if there's meant to be like a particularly poetic significance to the fact that Atreides, the like mythology is that they descended from the like Greek king. Do you know what I'm
Mhm.
talking about? They talk about that a little bit, but I really have yet to wrap my head around like why that's particularly significant.
I think that's like the, anybody who's listening can give their 2 cents as well. But that I think that has to do with, like, heretical bloodlines, right? And the only reason I think that is because at least in my part of America, where it's a little bit more prominent, who you were born into and who you're raised from, matters a little bit more here. And there's, like, a clear expectation of how you're expected to be because of just your family line, you know? That's the only thing I can think of now. Anybody who's much cleverer than me, can probably elaborate on that further.
Were there any other moments, or was that the one that?
Oh, that was the big moment for me. If I had to give a critique of this book, like a moment that I really didn't like,
Hmm.
which is my way of transitioning to that point, the end of the book was really, really, really rushed, which is a really big thing to say when you consider how thick this book is. But we spent a lot of time in the setup and making the setup happen, and we spent a lot of time in the catalyst of Paul being basically like, being in this family that ends up getting, slaughtered, and then the whole family goes out into the desert and blah 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 blah. But then as we kind of move like towards the end of the book, it was just kind of like, and then the jihad happened and things were good, right?
Yeah, it's a big fast slide away from
Yeah.
the long build up, and I think it speaks a little bit to the author's take on what he found interesting with the book,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
which was
Mhm.
clearly the like subtler like intrigue and maneuvering and weird like drug trips and the world building and stuff. He was like, "Oh, this is the cool part," and then he's like, "Also, I guess I have to have a story at the
Yeah,
end of
this
it."
the social revolution, it happened in 2 pages and it was done, and then that was the end of it, and Paul had some hallucinations about the future and realized he couldn't change it, so he just said, "Okay."
There you have it. The
Yeah,
ending
that was
summarized.
literally the last, like, 30 minutes of the book.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair criticism. I will not combat it.
Yeah,
The
and the thing that got me the most is, like, and then it, like, literally, the chapter opened with, like, "And then 10 years later, the jihad happened." I was like, "Wait, what happened over 10 years?"
Yeah, that's one thing I think. I don't know if I would say. I mean, my criticism of it is only really that it's made such a high barrier to entry for something so good. Is kind of
Mm,
disappointing and valuable, you know. So
mhm,
if I could change anything about this book, it might be to like distill it somehow so that you were still getting the bulk of the essence of it from something that someone would be more inclined to read,
mhm,
maybe like an
mhm.
abridged version that could not be bad and also be just as good, and get some other people to pick it up and read it. But man, I wish more people would read read books like this.
You could easily break that book up into 3 books, right? Because 'Cause you've got the setup for, like, what happens with the family, and then the aftermath of what the family went through. It could be another book, and then you've got, like, the whole, like, we'll call it the jihad, right?
Hmm.
Which is technically, like, 20 pages, but I'm like, that needs to be its own book. It really does.
It would be cool to explore for sure. uh
Mhm.
yeah, of all the parts you could have not fast forwarded through, it does beg the question why.
Yeah.
um
But what about you? What part of the book were you like, "No" to?
Let me think. I think there's some stuff that's just kind of like the fact that you didn't get to see much of a struggle. I think when this whole political thing unfolded, where it's like the best idea they had was, well, we'll go here and make this effort to make a stand, right? Like find tame the desert, borrow the strength of the people here, and that will be good. But the plan never feels like they're proactively working toward it. It seems like they're kind of just like taking their ease, settling in. It's like, guys,
Mhm.
did you forget the part where like you had this whole plan and you're supposed to be like ready for the thing that's about to come and annihilate you, the attack that you basically know is going to happen. And they're
Mhm.
just like, how will we mine the sand? And it's like, okay, well, is that really the thing that you need to 100% worry about right this second? Or should you
Mhm.
maybe be focusing on diplomacy right now? Yeah, I think that was my critique. There were some moves that an experienced Civ player or Stellaris player would be like, now hang on a second, what is this the best idea? Aren't these supposed to be supercomputers, like humans making these choices?
Mhm.
Uh, not the choice I would have gone with.
Y
It had
yeah,
to
that
happen.
makes me think of the military a little bit because, my father's a wonderful wood warrior, we'll say it that way. But when he raised me, outside of being able to, like, cook, hunt, and fix my own car and all this other stuff, he also raised me to ask questions, right? And one thing that I have learned both in, the military, corporate, and we'll even say, well, especially religion, is that when something is kind of passed down to you, you don't really ask questions about it, right? You just do what they tell them to. And the best example I can give in the military, because that will probably cause less offense, is that when we were given an order to go do something, right? And a typical person would hear the order and just go and do it. And I would look at the orders like, can I ask why I need to go and patrol like unit 4 or 5, right?
Hmm.
And if, the person that gave it to me said, "I don't wanna tell you, I just want you to keep alert," then that would have been fine, right? But a lot of people don't actually stop and be like, why am I doing this thing that you're asking me to do? Like, what? I don't understand, right?" And I think that might, and that I'm using military and religion, all the other stuff as an example, but I think as society we've kind of gotten out of the habit of trying to understand the why of why we do things, and we're kind of more reactive to it.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, we see a current event, we don't ask why it happened, we just react to the fact that it happened, right? Or we misunderstand it and we try to put a band-aid on a gushing neck wound, and the person still dies kind of situation, right? And one of the things I really do love about Dune and the what this book kind of demonstrated is that there were expectations and deliveries that were placed on different individuals, like not just Lady Jessica or Paul, but it was various people. And I think Paul's dad was the only one who didn't ask why.
Yeah.
um,
Paul's dad drops the ball a
yeah,
couple times.
yeah,
Actually, a
yeah, yeah.
lot. Because
Yeah,
he
he's
also
yeah.
yeah, he I don't know how good of a character he is. He's cool.
Let's
His
just say he
actor is
died for a
beautiful.
reason.
Yeah.
But a lot of the characters were always given directives from other sources and like, you're going to do this because of, whatever reason, right? And they were all kind of like, why do I have to do that? Like, that doesn't seem like a smart idea. This seems like the smart idea, and I'm going to go do that instead.
Yeah.
The ironic thing, at least in Dune, is that everything that people were doing out of a free will choice and not being forced onto them still ended up kind of like, making the great divine still happen. But I think, and this is a big thing for me, it doesn't matter what would have happened. People would have said that was part of the great divine anyway, because that's how they like to operate.
Yeah, right. It's we decide which prophecies were indeed self-fulfilling.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so to the matter of recommendations.
Oh, you have to read it. It's a classic, right? Because at the start of this, I said it was a keystone book that all of the books are kind of based off of in some shape or form. But the only way for you to know if they were is to actually read this book. And I will always encourage people to read classics because, oh man, like today, my soapbox won't be very big, I promise. But if you're not aware of the things that created the way forward, you don't really understand how they impact the foundation of things that are coming out today. And I read an article about something that they did with a comic book character, and that's as much detail as I will get into that. But when I was reading the article about how they were changing this comic book character, what they really did was they took him out of his universe and they put him into another universe of an actually more popular comic book character. And what they were trying to do when I was reading the article was that they were trying to kind of attract that particular fan base who liked the one universe into their story. And the only reason I knew that was because I was very well acquainted with the other universe and the story and everything that had been part of it. And so I can kind of call it out for what it is. But your average person who doesn't do a lot of in-depth reading, they don't read the books, they don't, familiarize themselves with like comic books or movies or anything else like that, they're not going to know. So when they go and experience this for the first time, it's going to be amazing until you show them the foundation material that it was built off of. So, and that's not me really saying that anything that comes out now is cheaper because it's kind of based off of something before, but it's acknowledging that the evolution of stories, just like music or anything else, is based off of something that came before it. And you can make it better and you can make it in your tune, but at least know it was made off of something, you
Yeah.
know?
Know the source material for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I recommend it maybe on the basis of like if you're hungry for good sociology type intrigue or like political themes and stories being told, or if you have any interest in maybe like the philosophy of transhumanism, any of those things qualify this as a must read. And yeah, exactly what you're saying about what a big deal it is. I mean, it's a surprise to exactly no one who's read it or like watched other stuff that it's inspired basically everyone from George Lucas to Hayao Miyazaki. Didn't they say that Nausicaa is basically like based on this?
Yeah, so Nausicaa is based off of this and a Jesus retelling because if you actually watch it, it's about Jesus coming back to Earth and saving humanity from their own sins.
Gotta love it. But yeah, that's I think that's it. I think we
Okay,
did it.
perfect. Oh, we did it. We did so well. Thank you for allowing me to yammer on about this. Now, I wanted to ask you if I could pick the next book that we were going to read.
Yes, please do. Let's hear it.
Okay, so So I wanted to pick a book that was based off of a very popular Netflix series, and I actually wanted to propose reading Altered Carbon by Richard Morgan.
Ooh, interesting. I feel like I think I watched the first like half of the first season of that show on
hmm
Netflix, but no,
hmm
never read the book. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, I watched both seasons and I thought that they were really good. But what made me want to read the book is that I told an angry Bostonian that I really liked the show, and he was like, "Shut up!" And I was like, "Oh no."
What? Okay.
Yeah, but no, he was very articulate in the changes between the book and the show
Oh,
to the
I see.
point where I
That's
was
why.
like, yeah,
Got
but I
it.
was like, I want to read it because I'm a not that I want to say I'm a big page to screen snob or anything else like that, but when you take a whole bunch of like creative liberties from the source material to spin some kind of other thing that's going on,
Yeah.
right? I kind of do want to go back to the source material. So I really wanted to read Alter Carbon by Richard Morgan and kind of pick out those differences. And since you've actually seen season one, then we can kind of have a fun discussion about things that happen in the studio when people decide to do adaptations of books.
Yeah, I think if I have time, I'll read the book and then I'll rewatch a bit of it so that I can
hmm
kind of pick up on what those will be. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. That'll be cool.
Excellent.
Isn't it? Is that the one where they do the kind of like cyberpunky thing of like you become a construct, you're like loaded onto a chip, and then you can just get plugged into somebody later?
Yeah, so the way that they have it done is that your entire consciousness is loaded onto a chip, and depending on what kind of program that you have, at least in the Netflix series, I haven't read the book yet, to verify that, but your consciousness would be uploaded and updated with whatever your current mode is, right? And if something happens to your body, then it goes to the next clone. So it's kind of like Eve Online in that sense. And if all your clones are
It
dead,
is like Eve Online.
yeah, it is.
That's so obscure.
I'm here for you and all your video game references.
That's so funny.
But yeah, so it is kind of like EVE Online, the video, the MMO, where if like the body that you're in is kind of like obliterated, then your consciousness goes to another one if you have one preloaded. So that's always fun.
Yeah, cool.
But yeah, yeah, I'm looking forward to finding the nuanced differences between the Netflix creative rights versus the original ones. So
Oh
that will be
yeah, I'm
fun.
sure. Oh, I can't wait to be upset. All
Yes. Now,
right, cool.
I will say the last time we had our podcast, there was no contrarians, and I was really hoping for one. But since we
Um,
picked a book,
yeah,
we
it'll
picked a
happen
book that
now.
had to do with like religion and free choice and all this other stuff. I'm hoping that somebody will give me their 2 cents. No
Yeah,
2 cents is wrong. We just want to hear your 2 cents.
we laid the bait for sure.
Yes, please come at us. We want to hear, I would rather say, what your thoughts on Dune and the themes of this book are. And again, there's no, like, I hate using the word safe space because I think it's been altercated, but like, this is a place that we like to talk about works, and there's no wrong answer here as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no wrong answer. All right. Well, till next time.
Until next time, you all be breezy and jazzy and enjoying your books, and we will see you all again real soon.
Adios.
Adios. Bye.